Despite my love of all things creepy, I'm a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. Before I get downvoted to hell, I would like to preface this by saying I'm trying to emphasize that I believe that there is a logical explanation for everything. That time I saw a black figure floating above me for about 5 minutes, sleep paralysis. That time I saw a pair of eyes reflecting some passing headlights in the cornfield across from my house, a deer. But here is one that I have yet to find an explanation for. To give you some backstory, I'm from a little farm town that nobody's heard of. The road I grew up on was named after the great-great-great-grandfather of our church secretary's husband. Yeah, that kind of podunk town. It was the late 90s, and I was probably 9 or 10 years old. My father worked third shift and was never home after 9:30 at night, and it was sometime in late winter, probably January or February. At the time, I had a cat named Sassy. To answer your questions, no, she doesn't die in this story, and yes, I named her after the cat in the movie Homeward Bound. How original do you expect a 3-year-old to be? Sassy was the runt of her litter, and incredibly docile. She never bit, never scratched, and never hissed. At least not until this particular night. Our routine started out like normal. I guess I'd gone to bed and was starting to drift off until Sassy decided to take her usual residence on my chest. I began absent-mindedly petting her as I worked on dozing off again, when all of a sudden she stood up and hissed. I bolted upright, instinctively knowing something was wrong. I crept out into the hall just in time to hear a knocking on the door. As I came around the corner into the living room, I saw my mother, frozen in shock, and her hands still on the doorknob. There were 2 figures standing outside, wearing what I would come to know as the Scream costumes. Time seemed to stand still, but the sound of my weight on the floorboards snapped my mother out of her trance. She slammed the door in their masked face and locked it all in one swift motion. She dashed for the phone and herded me into the hallway, which was the darkest area of our house, and the place where they would most likely be unable to see us if they were planning something. A police officer came very quickly and took my mother's statement and worked on calming her down. He then patrolled the neighborhood for at least the next hour while my mother called all the neighbors to warn them and see if they'd had any similar experiences. Unfortunately, the officer never did find anyone lurking around our house or the woods nearby, nor did our neighbors have any similar experiences. I found this particularly creepy for 2 reasons. Normally, I would assume that it was just a couple of asshat teenagers playing a prank, but looking back, they stood well over the height of my mother, and I suspect that they were adults judging by their build. Furthermore, why us? Why our house? There were dozens of similarly laid out houses. The only thing I can think of, now that I'm writing this out, is that they had observed us. They would know we were the only people on the block without a man home at night. If they were looking to perpetuate some sort of crime, my mother and her young daughter would certainly be the easiest to overpower. It still gives me the shivers thinking about it, and my mother often refuses to speak about it when I bring it up. Sassy never did hiss again. I've heard numerous stories about animals sensing tsunamis and other natural disasters, but not this type of thing. I still question what prompted her to hiss so violently, and what might have happened if she hadn't. Let's just say, I'm glad I'll never know. And of course, to those masked creeps all that time ago, let's not meet again. When this happened, I was 20. I'm female, and I should also point out that I'm short and I'm often confused for being a lot younger than I am. Even at 20, I was often mistaken for being 16. I was in Paris for the summer, and I had organized to go on a walking tour. The tour didn't start until late at night, and I'm always early to nearly everything, and this was no exception. I had over an hour to wait, so I went for a walk, and by the time I would walk back to the meeting point, it would be dark again. So, keeping myself busy, I started to walk the bridge, admiring the many locks that adorn it. It was then that I noticed a guy. When I looked up, he was looking at me. Noticing that I had caught him staring, his gaze drops and he shuffles along, seemingly doing the same thing as me, admiring the locks. Two things immediately caught my attention. One, he wasn't a tourist. He wore a very dirty vest with a workman's high-visibility vest over the top. Its brightness factor lessened by the fact that it was too covered in dirt and grime stains. 2. I had noticed him hanging around over 15 minutes ago, where most people, mostly couples, continued walking the bridge. He was lingering. I ignored him, convinced it was nothing but a weirdo who was harmless. I sat down on one of the benches, taking in the lights of the city. It was less than a minute before he sat himself down beside me. He smelled awful. I had to look in the other direction. He asked me where I was from, and there's no way I was going to give him any information about myself. I say nothing, but pretend to be overly interested in my phone, which didn't work in France and was therefore only there for show. I think you're alone, he says, but I tell him I'm not and I'm waiting for someone, and turn back to my phone. He asks if I want to have a coffee with him, and the way he asks makes it sound like a demand, not a question. I tell him no again and that I'm waiting for someone. He falls silent, not for long, however. He says it's cold, and to have coffee with him, he says again. By this point, I'd had enough. I'm not a rude person, and I avoid conflict, but he was not going to be leaving anytime soon. So I said, "If you're so cold, why don't you go home?" And he falls silent. It's at this point I reflect on what he's been saying, and realize that he's been purposely mistaking words while speaking English. Not the mistakes a Frenchman would say. I speak French, and I have many French friends. I know the mistakes they tend to make. This man was a native English speaker, who was pretending not to be. He says that he thinks I'm alone, and once again I tell him that I'm not. He is staring at me intently, and tells me that he doesn't think I'm waiting for anyone. I get up and tell him that that's exactly what I was doing, and I leave. I walk a little ways away, unsure as what to do, and he follows me. I keep walking, heading for the nearest couple over the other side of the bridge. I'm aware of him not far behind. I reach the couple, my heart jumping in my chest. I ask them in French if they would stay with me, that there's a man following me. And the couple just stares at me for a second in surprise and then agree. They ask if I was okay, and I look behind me to see where he was. He disappeared. To be gone that fast, he'd had to have run. So, creepy, fake Frenchman, let's not meet again. I was about 12 years old, and my school wasn't very far from where I lived. I had always taken the bus home from school when no one was available to pick me up. I guess my mom thought I was old enough to start letting me walk with other kids in my class, as we all lived pretty close to one another. On this one particular day, I was walking alone, and I don't remember exactly why, or if my mom even knew I had been walking alone sometimes. I had crossed the busy intersection at the lights, and was starting down the sidewalk. This was a very busy street in my city, so there was always a lot of traffic passing by. This one car had stopped at the curb, with no turning indicator on or four ways on, so it was odd that he was just stopped there, especially since it was such a busy road and was only one lane in each direction. He was causing a bit of a traffic backup. As I got closer to the car, I felt a little sketched out, and it was because my mother had raised me knowing that there were strange people in the world, and to always be cautious. Up until this point, I had never really experienced anything like this. I finally got to the point where I was standing beside the car. I didn't stop to look, however. I did glimpse into the window as I was passing by to see what the hell this guy was doing. The guy had his hand down his pants and was stroking himself, his head back and his eyes shut. I didn't fully understand it then, but I knew it wasn't right or normal. I started to run because it freaked me out, and I felt almost like I'd done something wrong because I'd glimpsed at him. As I was running, the same car pulled up beside me again. He slowed down to a crawl so he could keep up with me, and he had the passenger window rolled down now. I looked at him in horror, my eyes wide, and I was panicking. He was just smiling at me, this creepy-ass smile, and then he started laughing. He had one hand on the steering wheel, and the other was still down his pants. I booked it so fast that I felt like my chest was going to explode. I ended up turning down an alleyway onto the street beside it so I would lose the guy. I heard his tires squeal off as he sped up. When I came out of the alley onto the next street, just as I was about to get to the next alley, I saw the same car coming around the corner, slowly, as if he was looking for me. The entire rest of the way home, I kept looking over my shoulder while power walking to get home as fast as I could. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes that this whole ordeal went on, but it felt like hours to me. Roughly 2 years ago, I was working at a child care center and had had a bit of a rough day. I was on my way home, walking from the last bus stop from which I have to walk. I had to turn right onto a long street that wasn't often busy, but had a nursing home, a doctor's office, and a retirement village. As I was walking down the street, headphones in and facing forward, I noticed something out of the corner of my left eye on the road. At this point, it was only about 6 p.m. and still light out, but slowly getting darker. I looked at what was making the movement and saw a man driving slowly next to me. He was saying something to me, but the only thing I picked up was something like, "Hi, how are you, blah blah blah." I had glasses on and pretended I didn't see him as I really wasn't in the mood, so I averted my stare to in front of me again and continued walking, acting like I didn't even notice him. I stopped at one point to crouch down and roll a cigarette, still pretending he didn't exist. The man continued to talk to me and follow my pace, to which I still ignored for about a minute. He then sped up slightly and took the next right, I tried to call my boyfriend and he didn't answer, so I then called my mom to let her know what was happening. I was about a street and a half away from my own. She said she was cooking dinner, but she could send my little sister and her boyfriend out, to which I told her was a stupid idea, and that 2 16-year-olds weren't going to help me much. I had this feeling in my gut that he was waiting for me down the street that he had turned down, so I told my mom that, and we continued talking. After a few seconds, I reached the street that he had turned down, and sure enough, he was down there. As soon as I crossed the road, he sped out of the street and once again drove alongside me. At this point, I was still on the phone to my mom, but I spoke to her loudly that he was there and was following me, hoping he'd think it was the police. He still continued to try to talk to me. Again, I'm not sure what he said other than something about getting in the car and other gibberish that I didn't bother to listen to. Without warning, something inside me just snapped and the full educator mode came out in me. I turned and faced him, still on the phone. I put my hand up in front of me, looked him dead in the eyes, and firmly said, "You need to stop, okay? Just stop now." He started frantically rambling. I shouted over him and pointed my finger toward the end of the street. "You need to go now, so just go. Just go." I shouted while pointing aggressively. Before I could blink, he had sped off. I kind of laughed to my mom and told her what had happened, but still my guard was up that he'd be around the next corner. I got off the phone to my mom and continued walking and didn't see him the whole way home. Looking back now, I kind of laugh at how I handled the situation and the fact that childcare tactics do work, even on adults.